Welcome back, everybody, to Tenant Solutions. Kendall Clements with Escape Properties.
Scott Bird with Tenant Solutions.
Yeah, with Tenant Solutions. Right. So we've got an exciting topic for today. It's discussing the ESA animal, or the emotional support animal. Scott, maybe give us a brief background of how did the emotional support animal find its way to where we are today?
Yeah, it's becoming a bigger and bigger topic nowadays. So back in 1960s, you remember a guy by the name of Martin Luther King. Okay, so from him developed the anti-discrimination laws, and we call that in real estate the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah, the Fair Housing Act.
So that requires, so the way that it states is that there's, so the law requires that all persons have a right to seek fair housing based upon their qualifications without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, national orientation, familial status, disability, or source of income. So basically we're limited by being discriminated based on those classes.
Yeah, and it's a good piece of legislation in the big picture, but what we're seeing today is the emotional support animal has found its way there for people who have emotional or psychiatric needs for an animal to help stabilize, whether it's an anxiety or depression is a very common one. There's a handful of things that qualify for it.
Yeah, several.
Yep. So we look at, how does this impact landlords? We're going to talk about that a little bit today. But as Tenant Solutions go, we're really looking at, understanding and educating tenants to be the best tenants they can. And we just want to make sure that the tenants understand what their rights are with an emotional support animal, how to go about getting an emotional support animal, what the process is on that, but also making sure that landlords really understand the need of the tenant. At the end of the day, we want them to help accommodate that need out there.
Yeah, when there's a need, it's a great thing to support that need. So I'm excited for the topic and the discussion we'll have today. So
awesome. So looking here, there's a support animal, and then there's an emotional support animal. Let's talk about maybe what the difference is between the two out there a little bit, so we can understand. Today we're going to focus on specifically the emotional support animal, but most people will see one or the other, and there's some similarities perhaps, but there's some differences, and maybe we can talk about those for just a moment.
Okay, so what is the main difference? I think when you step back and look at it, a service animal is somebody who's providing a legit service to a person, an individual. So I like the example of a blind person. Okay, a service animal is going to help that specific person in that need. Now, an ESA, on the other hand, is
it's really an animal that has an emotional bond or no emotional support, where the service animal is a trained animal for a specific function. Yeah. The emotional support animal isn't trained. It's there for an emotional connection.
Yeah, compassion. Yeah,
compassion, companionship, even.
So the main difference you would say would be training.
Training. Okay. I think a support animal is restricted to a dog. There's been cases of monkeys, but I won't go into that. But it has to be an animal who can take on training or has been trained, has received specialized training for a specific function. So you look at people who have maybe issues with epilepsy. The dog is trained to be precognitive, to sense it coming on, or what to do in the event of an epileptic seizure.
Sure.
The things that they do and so forth. And they usually have a specialized vest and collar and stuff like that. Where an emotional support animal, you might just perceive them as a pet. And, cheesy segue here, is an emotional support animal just the family dog or whatnot?
Yeah. It could be, it couldn't be, right? I feel that, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves here, but I feel like a lot of times we try to make an excuse for our pet to become an ESA so that the landlord is required to let us have our pet in our place. We discourage that here.
Yeah.
We think it's, if you're being dishonest in your letter or your intent here, we advise you to kind of switch gears. It's not the intent to try to finagle your pet to be an ESA or to get a pet in the tenant or in the apartment. It's to really take care of you.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen in our business is I'll have an applicant come in and they'll specifically put down they have no pet on the application, get them approved, and within days of them moving in, they've then produced an ESA letter now declaring that this animal is an ESA pet. Now, is that wrong? It's probably not the most legitimate way of going about it, but I can understand why a tenant would do that, because a landlord who doesn't want to have a pet may try and find other ways to eliminate an applicant because of the legitimate ESA. So there's a fine line.
So you're saying a tenant would come in with no pet, get the agreement, move in, and then all of a sudden have an ESA.
Yep, I've seen that. I kind of I don't condone that pathway there, because I think honesty up front is always the best policy out there. Because you're building a long-term relationship with your landlord, and if you have to use tactics of deception or non-disclosure to communicate it, then something's wrong. In my personal opinion on that. Yeah. So our advice is, as tenants, take the high road, because I think it also diminishes the very real nature of why there's a need for an ESA animal in the first place. And if you don't have a legitimate reason, but you just want to have a pet, you're now diluting it for the people who actually have real needs out there. And I think it diminishes the quality of that person's value.
Yeah, good point
there. So,
for sure,
certainly some food for thought.
And it makes it so the landlord starts to distrust people, and of course that's just going to happen. But the goal is, like you said, have a strong relationship with the landlord. Not a bad one.
A good one. Yep. So, I think it's a concept. Is an ESA animal a pet, or are they a resource? Kind of like a person with a wheelchair. Wheelchair is not a pet, right? It's a resource, or it's a tool for that person to use. And I think as landlords, we're learning more and more that when a person approaches us with an ESA animal, that's how we should be looking through that lens of, this is a tool or a resource to help that person with a legitimate need, and not look at it as, okay, here's a destructive creature coming into my home. So there's some education taking place on the landlord side out there.
Yep, for sure.
So
okay.
Well, here's a good question, Scott. Are all landlords required to allow an ESA animal?
This is a good question. Now, this stumped me at first, because I initially thought yes, but there's a no to that exception. There's an exception to that rule, so there is a no out there. Any landlord who has fewer of 4 properties that they own or manage, and what was the other?
It's if they're using a professional management company.
Yeah, they're owner themselves.
They have to follow fair housing. But if they're self-managing 4 or less units, they can go outside the bounds out there.
Yeah, so you can. I mean, if you're getting somebody to tell you no, and they legitimately can, you can't go and force this rule. So make sure you double check, find out really how many properties they own or manage, to see if you really have something to require.
So we've actually had this scenario come up where we've got a duplex that the homeowner rents out the rooms individually rather than the unit to a single family. It's the rooms within the unit are rented out that direction. And so he has a business purpose for doing that, because the city has a requirement for him to do a certain way on that. He's been able to go to Utah Fair Housing, and I think it's administered through HUD, and they have actually ruled that he can discriminate against an emotional support animal because it would impair
the others.
It would impair the common area, and it would force somebody that might have a pet allergy in common space to now be at harm's risk on there. So it's a very narrow window, but I think that's a very valid question. So if you go through as a tenant and your landlord denies your emotional support animal, keep in mind it's a very narrow scope on there. And if you feel like the landlord isn't being factual on that, there's a lot of resources out there that you can call up. It doesn't cost any money, and walk through the scenario. For example, in this case, it was the state. We called the state up and gave them the scenario, and they came back and says, under these conditions, you can discriminate. And so we met those conditions. But it was valid because we had a tenant move in with an ESA cat. He'd been there for 4 or 5 months, and the owner thought this thing through and came back and says, I think I have an option here. And it was an interesting learning experience for us on there. But it fell under that very narrow scope out there. But I think as a general rule, Scott, most landlords, especially if they use a professional property management company, are going to follow the fair housing. And I think it's a very balanced approach out there for both tenant and landlord, right?
Yeah, good.
So what does a tenant need to do to get their pet approved, I guess, or documented as an emotional support animal?
Okay. Yeah, this is a good question. So really what has to happen is you as the person need to get a legit reason for having this service, ESA, emotional support animal. So you do that by going to a professional, filling out the form, talking to a doctor and getting that support animal letter in need. Now on the flip side, there's a misconception. This is something that everybody needs to be aware of. There's a lot of people, we won't say scamming yet, but there's a lot of people out there saying that you need a certification or a letter of certification and tags or something like that stating that the animal is designated for this emotional support service.
Yeah, the one that I've heard is that the animal has to be registered.
Registered, yeah.
Right. And I guess myth busting right here is there is no registry.
There is no mass registry. There's no certification forms that the animal would get that you would turn over to somebody. So if somebody's soliciting that to you, just be mindful that that's not legal. I mean, there's no registry out there.
Yeah.
So the only thing you really need is an ESA letter from the clinic professional that's providing that.
Yeah. So I tease a little bit because it used to be when you get married, you had to go to a preacher or the justice of the peace. Well, now you can go to letsgetmarried.com and they're now licensed to do it in the state. So we kind of look at this ESA kind of pulling that in. It's like, well, who is qualified to issue a letter? Can anybody just on the internet because they say they can do it? Because we've seen like the puppy store, here in town has provided letters, right?
Do they have a registry?
They don't have a well, they at one point in time they were producing cards to look like a registry, but it really wasn't. And so the puppy store approach, as I'll call it, I'm not trying to disparage the puppy store, but they were going these certain routes, and then they came back and said, well, we can't go that route. So what it is, it has to be a medical professional. It can be a nurse, it could be a nurse practitioner, it can be a psychiatric, it can be your primary health care provider, but it has to be a medical professional that can write a letter, and on the letter just has to have their license number and their state and their phone number stating that you qualify for an emotional support animal. They don't have to disclose why. They don't have to say, well, Kendall's a nut job and he requires an animal. It just says Kendall qualifies for an emotional support animal. That's it. It's as simple as that, a single line. But your landlord does have to have the ability to verify that person is a medical professional. They can't call up the medical professional and request your medical records or dig deep into understanding why out there. And I think that kind of ties into another question of does this letter ever expire?
Yeah, good point.
And so what have you seen out there? Do they expire?
I don't think so, but I would recommend just keeping current on a letter. So maybe every year, maybe if you were transitioning from one housing to another, get it before you leave, so you have an updated letter. So when you go to the new place, you know they have a valid one. You're not going to them with a 2 or 3 year old
outdated
letter. Yeah. But I don't know. I've never heard of any rule that's saying that those letters are valid for only a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
You?
But no, I haven't.
Okay.
Excellent feedback on that, Scott. But in our practice, once that ESA animal is in the home, we don't go back and recertify it at lease renewal or anything like that. But a landlord does have a right to ask for the letter to be updated on there. But there's no hard and fast rule that says it expires every year. There's no expiration date. But the idea is that if you have an emotional support issue, you should be seeing a professional from time to time on a routine basis to see if it still is necessary, right?
Okay.
Out there.
Okay, so another question I have for you. Can the landlord charge more
Oh, excellent.
because they have an ESA, emotional support animal?
I'd be interested to hear some of our listeners' stories on this.
I would too.
Get a broad base out there.
It'd be fun to hear on this one, but
In our practice, for a long time, we've been charging a pet rent out there. If we have a pet-friendly unit, we would charge pet rent. But what we've learned under the fair housing, because remember our first statement is an ESA animal a pet or is it a tool? And the way fair housing looks at it is, once it's designated for an emotional support animal, it is no longer considered a family pet. It is a tool for accommodation, and as a landlord, we're required under fair housing to make reasonable accommodation. So I can't charge an additional deposit, I can't charge an extra fee for it.
okay.
But on the flip side, if that animal does cause damage to a home, the tenant is still responsible for that. It doesn't alleviate responsibility,
Okay.
right? So as a landlord, sometimes you feel like, oh, they're putting all this burden upon us. No, the landlord's requirement is to make reasonable accommodation.
So if
That's
somebody's being charged more, or the landlord's unwilling to accommodate within reason, we want to hear
Yeah,
those stories.
we'd love to hear those stories and have good, healthy discussion about it in the comments. But I think just recapping that one point is the landlord is required to make reasonable accommodation. The tenant is still responsible for the actions of that animal.
Yeah.
Right?
So if a landlord's listening, it may be worth kind of trying to not remodel, but if you're going to replace carpet, maybe it's worth putting hard flooring or LVP flooring in.
It might cost 20-30% more to put the LVP in, but man, it just takes all of the major concern out from the landlord. Just prepare the home to accommodate.
When you made that comment earlier, and it kind of resonated. It's like, why? Like, things are changing. More and more people have ESAs. The homes kind of are being designed and finished to accommodate more animals these days.
Yep, it just makes sense. So that's really good advice out there. And just recapping a little bit here, for the tenant, have a legitimate reason. Don't just create one just so you can have a pet. And in reality, if you're getting a dog just for table scrap feeding, it's not good out there. But if you have a legitimate reason, and there are good legitimate reasons out there, follow that. Be honest. You'll be a better person for it, and you'll have a better relationship with your landlord out there. Advice for the landlord is learn how to be accommodating. Just because there's a pet in the home or an animal in the home doesn't mean there's destruction taking place.
There's not, especially nowadays. More and more pets or ESAs, they're well behaved. Actually, they're really good. And I've had some phenomenal tenants with pets that got turned down from other people, and I didn't see a reason why not to. Right, so I chose them as the tenants, or they were approved, and they were phenomenal tenants. Yeah. So some of the best.
We just had one move out that had there were at least 2 ESA animals in the home, and the owner was just beside himself, nervous that it was going to be destroyed. I was so pleased with that tenant. When we went in there, you couldn't smell a pet, but they'd hired a professional cleaner on the move out and had the home professionally cleaned. which in my opinion is going above and beyond because it just needs to be broom cleaned, right? But they did such a good job that I have no reservation in giving a specific recommendation for that ESA animal, for that tenant, because there's a relationship of responsibility of the tenant as well as the pet. And usually if you command respect of your pet, it's going to go very well out there. So,
cool. Well, we're excited.
All right, so we found a lot of resources out there. We'll put this down in the link in our post out here, but esadoctors.com has a very well laid out FAQ section, probably with 80 different questions that get asked out there on this topic, and it came from both landlord and tenant. I thought it was a very well balanced document out there. We'll put a link out there. If you have additional questions, that's a good resource to go look at out there.
Yeah, also if you're here in Utah, there's a Utah Legal Services hotline that you can call and have if you have questions about this. So a lot of services out there that we hope that you're able to find and utilize in your situations. There's a lot of help out there, and if somebody is really dealing with mental illness or have any kind of issues, they're serious. Take care of them. If you need an animal, get one. Proceed in some of these links that we have here, and get the help that you need. If you need an animal, by all means, we want you to be able to do that and know your rights as a tenant and work within those rights and work well with your landlord when needing that support and that emotional help. So we wish you all the best if you're experiencing that right now.
Well said. Excellent advice. Thanks for participating today. Put your comments in below. Scott and I will respond to those, and until next time.